I love to talk about this stuff. It's exciting. It gives my career, kind of meaning and, being able to look ahead to what things are going to look like and how we can shape it, as an industry, in a particular role in a particular company. Like that kind of stuff excites me.
I'm Hal Marcus.
And I'm Memme and Hal.
And this is Meeting of the Minds, the legal AI podcast from Evisort.
We interview lawyers, professors, and legal operations pioneers that are pushing the envelope.
Leaders using technology to drive great business outcomes and shape the future of the profession. Memme, another month, another fantastic interview, this time with Emily LaCroix, Global Data Protection Officer for Berkshire Hathaway Specialty Insurance. But when you first started working with her, she had a different title, right?
Yeah, no, at the time, she was the Chief Product Counsel. And this interview we were able to do on the sidelines of the Executive Innovation Summit at Harvard Law School, which was done in collaboration with Harvard Center for Legal Professions. So this is actually recorded on site at Harvard Law's podcast studio. And I'm really excited for folks to hear it.
Yeah, it was a really fun conversation with Emily. We talked about a very unusual career path that she's had. We talked about how she's on the AI steering committee and how she's evaluating AI risk in multiple ways, including as an underwriter for that risk.
Yeah, and what excites me the most about the conversations with folks in insurance is that as much as we talk about how contracts are the lifeblood of any company, in insurance, they really live that as the product that they're providing is a legal document with obligations that are worth tracking. And so really excited to dive in from that perspective.
And she gave us the perfect cocktail party joke for insurance. So what more could you ask for?
Without further ado, let's kick it off. Emily, thank you so much for joining us today. We really appreciate it.
Oh, I'm really happy to be here. Thanks for inviting me.
Now, this is ironic. We're here at Harvard Law School recording this, Memme's alma mater, but we have basically 3 generations of University of Michigan Law School in the house.
Mm-hmm. What year were you?
I graduated in 1990 from UM Law.
Okay.
And you were, 1 or 2 years after that, or 20 or something?
Yeah. And I was 2007.
There you go. And Memme's sister.
Yeah, my sister is going to be starting in the fall at U of M as well. But I was actually 1 or 2 years after that too, but that's just being born.
I'm feeling so good leading into this.
Yeah.
Let's dive into, what your role is right now, because you've been at Berkshire Hathaway now for 8 years.
Just over 8 years, which I've been joking. I have not done anything for 8 years. But no, it's been a wild ride, reflecting on it. My company, Berkshire Hathaway Specialty Insurance, was started in 2013. We have the distinction of being the only company that Warren Buffett started from the ground up as opposed to acquiring. I joined in 2016. I'm actually team number 401. And so we are now we're up in the 2000s now. And so I'm based in Boston and just trying to think. So I was hired as product counsel. And so obviously it's an insurance company. Our products are contracts, right? But then we also are a company that purchase services. So we have a lot of contracts. And when I joined, it was still very much in startup mode, right? And when even 11 years old for an insurance company, that's brand new. Like insurance is a very old business, right? Hundreds and hundreds of years, as our peers are. And so I was brought on as product counsel, but it was a very flat organization, still very lean. And it still is, honestly, in both those respects. But I was brought on to support the property team and help them develop their wordings. And so I'd talk to an underwriter and they would say to me, we would like to cover this, but not cover this. And I would tell them the right words to say, right? To get to that result, hopefully. You don't know until there's a claim, but I'm pretty sure. So I was able to go in-house, which was the best decision I've ever made. I've had phenomenal mentors, champions there, and phenomenal opportunities, because when you join a company 3 years in, especially on the legal team, right, which is so much, you're involved in so much in just building it out, whether it's, licensing in different countries, whether it's, developing new products, new product lines. and just supporting kind of in the growth stage. So anyways, I was brought on as a product attorney. Eventually we needed someone as the company grew, the legal team grew. And I have been very fortunate to be kind of every time a new role is kind of created, like on the leading edge, like, okay, well, now we need someone to do, regulatory affairs full time. I would take on that role. It's kind of someone would backfill. I was in the regulatory affairs position. So then I was senior counsel North America. So it was kind of this all encompassing, like, again, as needed role, whether it was product, whether it was regulatory, whether it was contracts. And so that's when I started really take over contracts. And so I started to take over kind of making sense of the contracts. And because it was still in start, at that point, it was, 5 years old, 6 years old, it had still been in startup mode. We didn't even know what the contracts were, right? Like different people had signed them, right? Like the head of IT had signed the one with Microsoft, and like the head of, ops had signed, a lease, and, the CLO had signed Lord knows what else, and like compensation agreements with brokers. And so I had to embark on this journey, which I loved, because turns out I really love projects. And that's something I wasn't really able to do when I was at a firm, right? So I had to start to think about, okay, how are we going to conceptualize the contracts? How are we going to organize them? What do we need? And so I've been told that I'm a lawyer that thinks like an engineer. And I was told that by an engineer who's been told he thinks like a lawyer. So it was I don't know, I really liked the designing, almost like the architecture of it, right? And so I knew that we needed something to make sense of, because we were just storing contracts on a share drive, which was, at one point I could have told you what every single contract we had was for and who was, the business owner for it and all that. Yeah, giving me a face because I was the person.
So much.
Yes.
Yeah.
And at that time there weren't, a couple hundred, but, we knew that we needed to kind of like future proof. And so luckily I had the support of my, chief information officer. And, we really kind of got this push, and it was my baby that I really ran with. We don't have a legal ops team, or we didn't then. And we just kind of made it happen. And there were definitely times, I think, I did a webinar a couple of years ago on this, but my GC said, which contracts of ours have FCPA, Foreign Corrupt Practices Act clauses in them, right? And I'm like, ooh, this is the kind of thing that's like made for Evisort, right? And being able to kind of pull that up. And, again, I was like, well, it just paid for itself. We are now kind of embarking on a third-party risk management because we're fairly mature, and making it a more formalized process as opposed to kind of like ad hoc, like just assuming that everyone is like doing due diligence on whoever they need to be hiring. So actually going back, I told you I like to talk.
That's why you're here.
I'm like, you guys are just like smiling and nodding. I'm just
you are making our lives so easy today. Yeah.
So after it was North American counsels, I kind of moved into another product role because we were expanding our accident and health, A&H, and also our consumer products, like direct to consumer, which, we have two primarily lines of business that do that, which brings a whole host of other, once you're in consumer, right? This is pre-CCPA, but there's a whole bunch of other, all of a sudden, things you need to be worrying about, right? Because state insurance regulators care about that stuff. And so then backing up, when I was first hired, I was hired because the woman who had been product attorney for property had gone to Hong Kong to stand up our Hong Kong operation. She is now like head of Asia, Middle East, and she's phenomenal. But at the time I was hired, and I was like young and childless, and, I rented, like, who cares? So I told my GC, Ralph, I said, if there's ever another opportunity for travel, let me know. And he remembered that. And, 6 years later, he said, look, we've been looking, our head of compliance for Europe had left. He said, we've been looking for a head of compliance for Europe. It's a really tight market, especially post-Brexit, right? Because now all of a sudden our European headquarters are in Dublin. And post-Brexit, everyone who had their European headquarters in London were now up the creek, especially for like GDPR purposes, right? Like all of a sudden now you're processing European data outside of the EU, right? And so for insurance, you have the freedom of services, right? If you're in the EU, you're licensed in the EU, it's very similar to the United States, right? Where if you're a Massachusetts company, you can do business, in New York. It's, so we're an Irish company, we can do business in all these other EU states. So we were having trouble finding someone to be our head of compliance. And so Ralph asked me, he's like, hey, remember you said you were up for travel? And I was like, yes. So my son and I went there for about a year, which was incredible. And then we found a head of compliance for Europe, who's wonderful. And at that point, I was promoted to Global Data Protection Officer. So if you had told me when I graduated law school 15 plus years ago that I would spend my days talking to IT, I'd be like, that makes zero sense. But I love it because I think similar saying, like having meaning in your work, there's something just so tangible and concrete, right? Where you're not writing briefs, you're not making arguments, you're not kind of in the ephemera. You are reading, regulations or contracts or these written things and making them real, right? You read GDPR and you're like, okay, we need to do X, Y, and Z, talking to our Chief Information Security Officer. How are we doing this? Show me how we're doing this, and coming to kind of make, the practical application of all these laws, because any lawyer can tell you what the law says, right? Oh, well, you have to do this.
I'm not sure any lawyer could tell you what the law says about data privacy at this point in time, because it's such a complicated patchwork, right? It's changing and evolving all
and
the
there
time.
will never be I don't think there will ever be a federal one. I don't know, unless California concedes, but maybe there'll be enough industry pressure. We're still very much in building mode and growth mode. And so to be able, I think a lot of the challenge in like the legal ops space is trying to backfill, like backtrack, make up for things, for your legacy contracts, your legacy systems, legacy knowledge management, that, right? Everything that everyone knows that no one wrote down. And so I only have a decade of that to worry about, but, multiple decades ahead of my career and also my company's. And so being in that space where we can kind of build it into the fabric of the legal team, it's also, a very fairly young legal team, both in not just in age, but in mindset, and being willing to, see the value of new things, not being stuck in the, well, in my day, we did it this way. And what do you, robot's not gonna be smarter than a lawyer, and thinking that, AI is a robot in the first place. And, we're just really I'm trying to adopt it. And so one of the things I'm working on with a working group on the legal team is knowledge management, right? Because we're like, all right, it's been over a decade. We can't just keep searching our emails. We can't rely on institutional knowledge. Back in the day when the entire legal team was in Boston, sure, we are now spread out, on 4 different continents. That doesn't work, right? We're not co-located. There's not this kind of informal learning that takes place. So I think that's definitely been one of my things that I'm pushing for. And I think especially being like in the data protection role, I'm working on setting up like an entire data protection framework and program, and something that's going to lead us into the future. And so that takes time. For me too, it was a big shift in my mindset to be like, okay, I worked all day and it just consisted of a lot of thinking and not a lot of, kind of producing things. And again, as someone who's used to billable hours, right? And if you can't bill for thinking, you have to either call it something else, or, you can only bill for the writing. And I remember being in private practice. There was one time I wrote a memo and I billed 5.5 hours for it, or a brief or something. It was a brief, I think. And I spent 5.5 hours. And the client came back and had slashed it to 5. And was like, we think that this should only have taken you 5 hours. I'm like, really? Like, I think they were just doing like 10% across the board. But how do you tell someone how long something should take to write? Right. And I have friends who are still in firms and, doing the hourly thing. And I'm like, my God, how can you, I'm like, I sat in meetings. I talked, I thought, I collaborated, right? And again, I don't have anything written to show for it, not today, but I will next month, right? And I couldn't do that without the stuff today. So I think it's a whole mindset shift of, being able to kind of slow down and take the long view of things.
Right. And with the data privacy officer, I mean, earlier you said if you had told me 15 years ago, I'd
Yeah.
be talking to IT every day, I would have said you're crazy. I thought where you were going with that was you would have said, what's a data protection officer?
Oh, yeah. No,
It's it's just emerged really, as has legal ops over that time frame. And so much of what you're focused on is laying the foundation so that at some point off in the future, you're not facing a challenge. You're not dealing with regulatory challenges and litigation and class actions and all sorts of things. So, when you're in a risk management mode for the long haul, how do you look, at the successes on a rolling basis?
Well, right. When you're in risk management, success is nobody knows you're there, right? Like you have not failed, therefore good job, right? Nothing went wrong. So I think, and it's funny because risk in other parts of the world is much more, again, like regulatory involved. But again, like in an insurance company, our business is risk, right? I mean, that's what we do. We quantify risk. We calculate what it's worth and what the risk is worth and collect premium and hold on to it, hold on to reserves because what we think the risk is going to be. And then, but that's our outward facing products. And then just internally, just trying to think about where our risks are. And again, they're ever evolving. If you had said, data, cybersecurity has been a risk for a long time. Data privacy, regulatory violations, new, right? People's, data subject requests are new. Regulatory requirements to maintain records of processing activities, new. And it's all these kind of additional requirements that you just have to do, right? And just maintain and keep on top of.
Well, when we talked like early on, and that was when your senior counsel, chief product counsel roles, I was always really struck by something you've mentioned a couple times, which is that in insurance, the business, what you're selling is really contracts. And of course, from where I sit thinking about contract data and analytics all the time, that was just music, to my ears. And especially going through COVID, where I'm sure there was a lot of really niche things in insurance. Well, is this insured? Was this not? Could you just talk about kind of the impact, in your industry of being able to get deep visibility into contractual language, which might be different, still important in other fields, but maybe not rise to the same level?
It's funny because I remember at the beginning of COVID, my GC came to me and said, what do our contracts say about force majeure? And I was like, our contracts? Like, okay. I said, I can tell you what the top 3 say. And we did have Evisort. It wasn't like fully functional because we were still in the mode of, we had loaded, I think, over 1,000 contracts or over 1,000 documents in. We were reducing duplicates. We were getting, dividing them into active and ones which had expired, connecting statements of work or addendum to the actual, original 4 corners. And so when he came to me and said, oh, what does it say about force majeure? I'm like, I will tell you what our largest outsourcing contracts say about force majeure, but I'm not going to tell you what everything says because I can't. Now I could. Or again, with the new document X-ray that they were demoing upstairs, it would be a kind of different thing, which I also think like force majeure is such a ridiculous term anyways, right? Like
just by virtue of it being French or otherwise.
I'm just sipping an espresso, smoking a cigarette. Oh, force majeure. So I don't know, just because like it's a catch-all and like what, I don't know. Again, like in insurance, what we do is we define things that we cover and or don't cover.
Yeah.
And force majeure,
act of God.
Right.
It's a little vague.
Well, and again, like an earthquake is an act of little g God. And
if you're a person of faith, we're all acts of God.
Right. Our very existence. And so the rapture will be covered because it is an act of God.
You've heard it here.
I know. Don't bind me to that. When there'll be coverage litigation, they'll be like, well, they had their, legal counsel on and she said it was covered. And I bought this insurance in reliance on the fact that the rapture would be covered. But no, I think it's ridiculous. Any natural disaster is a force of act of God, right? Anything short of like a willful, intentional, right? Like again, like terrorism, right? Or that kind of, arson. Everything that you're insuring against is an act of God. So why are we setting it as this like catch-all that like we've already thought of all the risks, right? Like earthquakes, fires, tornadoes, hurricanes, tsunamis, volcanoes. I don't know. Volcano counts as earth movement, not earthquake, is one thing I learned when I was property counsel.
Really?
Right. Yeah.
Wow.
And I'm like, nobody cares about that, but it counts because it's like tectonic activity. But anyways.
God, I'm picturing the dialogue in front of a jury about quake versus movement.
Oh, it's a big thing. The EQ versus EM.
Wow. There are acronyms for it. This
There's
is a
so
whole
many,
area
there's
of law. I
so
didn't know
many
anything about.
acronyms. I don't know if it's just, there's so many acronyms everywhere, right? I mean, you guys are CLM.
Yeah.
People are like, what's that? And just,
Well, that begs a question I'm curious about then. You're talking about getting out of the contract the data points that really matter. What are the, being specific, being clear. Do you foresee hypothetically a future where because we've gotten so good now at pulling out those data points, right? But it's still starting with the artful language, the force majeures and the rest of it of a contract. Do you foresee a future where there's some unified, standardized way of looking at the data points and less reliance, less, on the artful language?
So my mentor, my longest relationship, has done a thought experiment, which is what is the shortest insurance contract could possibly be? And he has come to the conclusion that it would be 3 words: coverage as agreed. And so when I think about, data points, right?
Yeah.
Is it possible that somehow you could pull together, again, like in the future, these data points and everyone would know, right? And it could even be, there's some like cyber insurance policies now, or there are certain products that are like smart insurance policies. And I think premium goes up and down depending on what the risk is any given day, right? If, you wrote a policy during hurricane season, instead of thinking of it as a 1-year policy, right? And we don't sell hurricane insurance after July 1st, because by then we know what's going to happen, right? But, so all named windstorm policies are written before July 1st, and that's their policy cycle. But if it wasn't these dynamic contracts and dynamic pricing, as opposed to a 1-year, you have an actuary, look at what the coverage is, look at what the risk is, the severity and the frequency, come up with a number for what it should cost for the whole year for that specific risk. And instead, I could see a future and some companies are experimenting with these dynamic, like you price it every day. What does it cost to insure you against cyber today? What does it cost to insure you against, a tsunami today?
Wow. I'm picturing like when you book a flight and you see the calendar with the different prices on all the different days. That's what this is looking like.
Right. And there's no reason that, insurance policies have to be a year long. Some of them, it's called a MISL, MYSL, multi-year single limit policy. So, we'll write you.
There's nothing intimidating at all about that aspect, by the way.
It's a single limit. You're like, all right, we'll cover you for 2 years. But if you blow the limit in the first week, you're out of luck. And so I could see, and that's what questions I've asked, and I think, again, insurance has been around for hundreds of years, right? And, we've come to this conclusion that like casualty liability policies for a year, with a long tail, property for a year, right? Anything bad that happens within a year is in this policy. And then next year is in next year's policy. If there was, why can't there be a 6-month? There are some 6-month policies, like for if you're doing a specific project, right? So if we're writing liability for a consultant, right? You can do a per project policy that only lasts as long or as short as the actual project that you're doing, or you can do travel insurance that only lasts for the length of the trip. I think as people get more price sensitive, but again, it's a very highly regulated space, and maybe that's the reason that we're still stuck on the 1 year. But, I could see this whole, like you said, the chart of, if you buy on this day, it'll cost this much. And if you buy on this day, it'll cost this much. And having it be, I think the data points too, being much more personalized or, customized, right? And knowing the difference between what you should charge, Amazon for cyber versus Google for cyber.
We're here at our Harvard Executive Innovation Summit that Evisort has sponsored with great speakers from Harvard Law School. And one of the themes that came up in one of those talks, I think last night, was a data-driven risk management. And you're talking about data-driven risk pricing. I mean, very dynamic, very flexible. How is that evolving in what you do?
In me personally, in my actual title, maybe less so. But I also sit on the AI steering committee for my company. We kind of have this freedom to let's explore what makes sense as use cases. And people who in like ops and IT are really, really excited to, run with proofs of concept. And I'm sitting here like, guys, put on the brakes. We need governance. We need, right? Like data governance. We need information governance. We need AI governance. How are we going to make these decisions, right? When people come to us and ask for an exception to whatever our policy is, how are we going to make those decisions? So again, I'm very into laying the foundation. And so I think that's a huge part of that. And I think it's, again, for AI, which, and risk management as respects AI. And again, we're underwriting AI as a risk, right? So we're getting it on both ends, both as, a consumer of AI and also underwriting other consumers of AI. And so we're, proceeding, I don't want to say with caution, but I would say thoughtfully, so that we don't get so far down the line and look back and realize that we missed something huge, right? That we like built this car and we're like, oh, we did forget to, put in this part that's way in the, I'm not a car person. It was a terrible example. I don't know why I led with that, but that you're not missing something crucial for the whole thing to work.
This had not occurred to me that you've got this particular window into this area of risk. We talked to a lot of GCs that are already sort of on both sides of it, in that they're being tasked with doing a lot more with AI, being more efficient with AI, being more data-driven with AI, at the same time that they are given the task of setting the rules for the entire organization, for development teams, engineers, HR, et cetera, around what they can and can't do with AI. So they're already of two minds. You're actually looking at it as a risk evaluation for your entire offering.
Right. When we talk about, data-driven decision-making, I mean, you're describing what an actuary does. Although there is a joke in the insurance world.
Oh, please tell us the joke in the insurance world.
That actuaries drive the car by looking in the rearview mirror. Which, I mean, that's all you can do, right?
Yeah.
And there's an oversimplification and there's predictive modeling, and that's a thing. But, to some degree, you're relying on past events, past experiences to price for future risks. So that's, again, you can use that one at cocktail parties. But that's, so when we talk about data-driven decision-making, I mean, that's what actuaries do. And they're, one of our core, or even underwriters, right? Underwriters look at a company, look at a risk and say, what could possibly go wrong here? And then, they price for that, or decline and say, absolutely not, right? You want me to insure your trampoline park? Hard no. So there's that kind of, again, built into it, the underwriting, the actuary, thinking both in the abstract, like what could go wrong? And then with the data points, how much would it cost, right, if it went wrong?
From the outside looking in, especially me who's been like following you and watching your career, it seems like being global data protection officer is so different than what you were doing as Chief Product Counsel. And I'm sure it is. I'm wondering, are there any through lines, even maybe like the skills you're using or kind of issues that you're dealing with that is it maybe more similar than it seems, or is it as stark as a difference as it seems?
I mean, again, we're a growing company, so there are some responsibilities that like don't fall within titles that we're still already doing. Like part of the reason I became Global Data Protection Officer is because I was handling contracts. Contracts were having all this data protection language, and I was evaluating whether it was, sufficient, whether it was compliant. And so I kind of I had to, when GDPR was rolled out, I had to evaluate, did it, and this was in my role as like senior counsel or even, maybe as product counsel, just does this apply to us? If so, how? What language do we need to have in our contracts in terms of either indemnification or, delegating risk? And so that part of it kind of I became the default person. So even now that I don't own the contract process, if someone is reading a contract and there's data protection language in it, they will flip it to me and say, I refer you to everything else. Can you please review section like 8.1 for data protection. And that's globally, right? Whether it's a European contract or, it's everything from, again, in Europe, the actual insurance agreements themselves involve the transfer of data, but also in the United States, everything we're giving data back and forth, some of it personal, some of it confidential, sensitive business information. Almost every submission we get is subject to an NDA, right? And that's another interesting thing that we've come up with, which is, can we train our own, AI? Because I think, the question is always, you want your tool, you have the brain of the LLM, and then you teach it how to be your LLM, right? Here's my data, here's how we're doing it. And right, we have an NDA with this submission that's saying the only thing we will do with this submission is underwrite your insurance policy and administer claims. We didn't say that we could use it to train our AI systems, right? And those types of questions, which again, I'm kind of tasked with, because it is a data privacy thing. It's a data protection thing, right? We told you, the limitation of purpose and the limitation of why, right? Someone gave you their data for a purpose, and GDPR words, capital P processing, and you're supposed to only process it in the way you said you would process it and not beyond that. So there is, I think, some crossover in like the contract world and, the data privacy world into the AI world that we're still kind of navigating.
I used to do work in patent litigation many years ago, and the move from analog to digital was confounding a lot of things. So the doctrine of equivalency was saying you can apply the same rules to it, but you have to adapt a little bit as you go. As AI evolves, the way that it's used, the use cases of it, the output from it, what it means to train the AI, these things are all kind of evolving too as we move into LLMs and more generative tools. And of course, we're using the full suite and using them in conjunction to get better, more solid results. But yeah, it does open some new nuances. And when people say, do you train with the data? We have to define train now. Train's a little different from what it was maybe a few years ago.
Yeah. It's funny. Just speaking of evolution, when I started practicing law, 2008, the big thing, the hot topic was e-discovery, right? It was just e-discovery, the federal rules of practice around e-discovery.
Yeah.
Now it's just called discovery, right? Is anyone handing over paper, or are we handing over, flash drives or setting up an SFTP to get the information from point A to point B, right? Or even, again, like using AI to the document searches to redact things, right? That again, I'm just on the cusp of having to, in the start of my career, redact things with a Sharpie. I know, I'm a little bit older than you, Memme. But yeah, and just then having to photocopy it.
If
right?
it's any consolation, I remember Bates stamping.
I had forgotten about Bates stamping.
Yeah. That was a little before your time.
No, I knew what it was.
Well, yeah, because we still called it Bates stamping, even though it wasn't the stamper.
No, because that was the big thing. Adobe, you would, have a PDF and tell it to Bates stamp.
Yeah.
Huh. I wonder whatever happened to good old Bates. Like, what's he up to these days?
It's gone the way of the Dewey Decimal System.
Oh, so Dewey and Bates are just hanging out together.
Yeah, but we know their names.
I know. That's the thing, is that these people live on partially.
They're somewhere out there with Shepard, so.
Yes. See, we're such nerds, you guys.
He got a verb.
It's true.
Shepardize, that's pretty cool.
Yeah.
Emily, thank you so much for your time today. We really appreciate it.
Literally, anytime you want to do a podcast, just call me and just say, Emily, what are you thinking about today? And then I will just, stream of consciousness until you're like, okay, we're done. So thank you so much for having me. It's, I love to talk about this stuff. It's exciting. It gives my career, kind of meaning and, being able to look ahead to what things are going to look like and how we can shape it, as an industry, in a particular role in a particular company. Like that kind of stuff excites me. So thank you so much for letting me talk about it.
Total pleasure, Emily. Thanks.
All right. Thank you.
Meeting of the Minds, the Legal AI podcast, is brought to you by Evisort. To learn more about Evisort and how we can help you contract better with AI, visit Evisort, EVISORT.com.
You can find Meeting of the Minds on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever else you listen to podcasts. Don't forget to click subscribe so you won't miss future episodes.
On behalf of everyone here at Evisort, thanks for tuning in.